The bright studio lights shone down, their intensity enough to make anyone uneasy. What was meant to be just another late-night broadcast quickly escalated into something much more. Stephen Colbert, always prepared to deliver his signature sarcasm, leaned into the microphone, ready for his usual biting commentary. But this time, something shifted. The scripted humour wasn't just a joke, it was a personal attack. With a mocking grin, Colbert muttered, "He got what he deserved." The words hit the air like a heavy blow. Some audience members chuckled nervously, unsure of what had been said. Others clapped, still processing the moment. However, for Karoline Leavitt, sitting quietly off camera, those words were crystal clear. Colbert wasn't talking about just anyone. He was referring to Charlie Kirk, a man she considered a close friend and ally. Charlie had been a force in politics, driven by deep convictions, never swayed by public opinion or applause. And in this moment, Colbert had just desecrated his memory in front of millions. Karoline didn't react outwardly. She remained perfectly still, her right hand clenched into a fist, her posture unyielding. As the crew prepared to cut to her, the tension in the room was palpable. The producer's voice came through Colbert's earpiece. "We're live with Karoline in 5. Colbert, smug as ever, replied, "Even better." The camera switched, and there she was. Karoline appeared on screen, her navy suit a stark contrast to the colourful antics of the late-night world. She had no need for flashy colours or dramatic flair, just a clean, sharp look with a small silver cross hanging around her neck. It was intentional, calculated. "Welcome back, Karoline," Colbert greeted, still riding the wave of his earlier mockery. "It's a shame about Charlie, but honestly, he played with fire." Karoline didn't give him the satisfaction of waiting for the next line. She leaned forward, hands planted firmly on the desk, and locked eyes with Colbert. Her voice was steady, cold as ice. "Say his name again. I dare you." The room fell silent. The usual clatter of the band disappeared. Colbert, for once, wasn't in control. He had crossed a line, and Karoline wasn't about to let him off easy. This wasn't about entertainment. This wasn't a game. Karoline was fighting for something far more important than ratings or applause. She was fighting for honour. And she would not stand by while Colbert mocked a man who had given everything for his beliefs. For a brief moment, Colbert's usual cocky grin wavered. Karoline had caught it. She wasn't a guest on his show. She was his equal. His reckoning. The stage had shifted. Colbert now understood he wasn't dealing with someone who would simply roll with the punches. He finally muttered Charlie Kirk's name again, dragging out each syllable with deliberate exaggeration. Charlie Kirk, provocateur. He played politics like it was a game of destruction. And sometimes people like that crash. He laughed, his tone meant to ignite anger. But Karoline stood firm, unaffected. Without missing a beat, she reached inside her blazer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Her fingers shook, not out of fear, but because of the weight of what she was holding. She placed it in front of him. "What's this?" Colbert asked, his eyes flicking to the paper, but wary of what it might mean. "His final words," Karoline responded, her voice sharp and unyielding. "The message he wrote the night before he died. Private, unpublished. Until now." Colbert hesitated, his hand hovering over the paper, trying to regain control of the room. "This is just drama," he muttered, clearly uncomfortable. "No!" Karoline shot back. "You played disrespect. I'm giving him the voice you tried to silence." The studio had changed. The energy that usually thrived on jokes and chaos had dissipated. Now, all eyes were on Karoline, all focus on the letter. Colbert, desperate to deflect, let out another forced laugh. But this time, it didn't land. "So now we're doing story time," he scoffed, trying to make light of the situation. Karoline didn't respond with words. She unfolded the letter slowly and began reading. Her tone wasn't theatrical, but grounded, honest. If this world silences me, let it be known. I never once bent for approval. I lived for truth, not for applause. And if my words outlast me, let them resonate in the halls they tried to shut down. She paused for a moment, her jaw tightening. Then her gaze hardened as she spoke directly to Colbert. You didn't just insult him, you spat on his sacrifice. And now you expect me to sit here and smile. Colbert's posture shifted. No longer in control, he leaned back. The power dynamic had changed. Karoline wasn't just confronting a late-night host. She was standing against an entire culture, a media system that ridiculed what it didn't understand. Karoline remained completely still. She didn't need to raise her voice because the weight of the silence in the room was more powerful than anything she could say. This wasn't about entertainment anymore. This was a moment of reckoning. Colbert leaned in, elbows on the desk, trying to take control of the situation like a predator, sizing up its prey. You're getting emotional, he said, forcing a grin. Maybe we should go to a commercial, give you a moment to cool off. Karoline's gaze remained unwavering. Is this how you handle uncomfortable truths, Stephen? Cut to black when things get too real? Colbert let out an awkward laugh, but this time there was no confidence behind it. This is a comedy show, Karoline, not a funeral. Karoline stood up, her movement purposeful, not a protest, but a declaration. The audience gasped, not from surprise, but from the electric shift in the atmosphere. She didn't walk around or make dramatic gestures. She simply stood, looked Colbert in the eye and calmly said, You laugh. I bury my friend. Colbert attempted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Karoline didn't give him a chance to recover. She continued, her voice steady, but filled with rising intensity. You sat there, behind that desk, and mocked a man who gave his life for this country's voice. A man who fought with words, while people like you only fight with smirks and snide remarks. The producer, off camera, frantically motioned to cut the feed, but the cameras stayed locked on Karoline. Turning toward the audience, Karoline spoke directly to the millions watching. You don't have to agree with him, but mocking his death to get likes? That's not wit, that's rot. Then, with piercing clarity, she asked, Ever served your country, Stephen? Colbert's expression faltered. He blinked, caught off guard. No, he replied quietly. Ever stood at the grave of someone who was threatened just for speaking their truth? Karoline's voice rang out unwavering. No, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Then don't talk about what someone deserves, Karoline shot back. The silence that followed was suffocating, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Colbert found his voice again. You want to turn this into a political moment. Karoline moved closer to him, her words unwavering. You already did. For the first time that night, Colbert didn't have a comeback. He leaned back, his face flushed with frustration, his eyes darting around the room in search of a way out. But there was no escape. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They simply watched in stunned silence, aware of the shift that had just taken place. Karoline didn't sit down. Instead, she stood tall, her presence commanding the room. Her figure cast a long shadow over the bright lights and polished set. The cameras rolled, capturing every moment, and Colbert, normally the master of this space, was left speechless, gripping his cue cards as if they were a lifeline. Karoline then reached into her blazer. The tension in the room grew. Even Colbert stiffened. She pulled out a letter, worn at the creases, the edges frayed. She held it up slowly, as if it was something sacred. It was the last letter Charlie Kirk had ever written to her. "This wasn't meant for the headlines," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "This wasn't meant to be read on air." Colbert tried to interrupt, eager to regain control. "But since you've opened this grave, let's tell the truth," he said, attempting to brush off the moment. Karoline didn't let him. "No," she said sharply. "You don't get to define this narrative. I do." She turned to the camera and began to read from the letter. "Charlie wrote this after receiving another round of death threats. And you know what his main concern was? Me. He was worried about my safety while traveling to an event. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He prayed for me." Karoline's fingers trembled slightly as she held the letter, but her resolve was unwavering. She looked down at it before turning back to the camera. He wrote, "Karoline, they want us quiet, but we don't raise our voices to be loud. We do it so others know they're not alone. If I fall, don't stop. If they laugh, speak louder. If they lie, read the truth out loud." The words hit the air like a shockwave, raw and electrifying. Karoline folded the letter carefully, as if it held the weight of a lifetime. She then looked back at Colbert, her gaze unflinching. "You mocked a man who bled conviction," she said with quiet intensity. "A man who didn't need a desk, a teleprompter, or applause to speak the truth." Colbert shifted uncomfortably, clearly rattled now. He leaned back in his chair, trying to salvage something from the moment. "It's just a late-night show, Karoline. People come here to laugh." Karoline nodded slowly, her voice cutting through the tension. "Then why are they crying?" A tear slid down the cheek of a woman sitting in the front row. The room was still. No applause, no laughter. The weight of Karoline's words had made that impossible. Karoline slowly returned to her seat, the letter resting between them like an undeniable statement. It wasn't just paper. It was an indictment. The truth had been laid bare. Colbert didn't make a move. He couldn't bring himself to touch the letter. In that moment, it was clear to everyone. What lay on that desk carried more weight than everything Colbert had just said combined. He looked at the paper, almost as if it might combust in front of him. For once, the man known for tearing people apart with sarcasm had nothing to offer. No witty retort, no mocking jibe. The audience, usually primed for laughs, sat in stiff silence. They weren't waiting for the next joke. They were waiting for the next blow, and Karoline was ready to deliver it. With calm precision, Karoline turned back to Colbert, her voice cutting through the silence. "You stood there," she began, her words deliberate and sharp. "And you said that he got what he deserved. You think that's edgy?" "No, Stephen, it's cowardly." Colbert blinked, trying to backpedal. "It was just a joke." Karoline's voice sharpened. "Stop hiding behind that word. Satire requires substance. What you did was smear a man who can no longer defend himself. You did it from behind a desk, knowing he couldn't respond." The control room faltered, unsure of what to do next. Should they cut the feed? Should they go to commercial? But the producers, sensing the growing firestorm online, chose to keep rolling. And as they did, the internet exploded. Twitter buzzed with activity. YouTube views surged. The clash of Karoline versus Colbert quickly became the top trending topic, surpassing even global news. Karoline leaned in, her words purposeful and steady. "You've had senators, presidents, powerful figures on this show, but the one man who truly made you uncomfortable was a 30-something conservative who spoke with words that cut deeper than any punchline you could deliver and lived by principles you can't understand." Colbert, flustered and trying to regain control, straightened his blazer. "I poke fun at everyone, Karoline. Left, right, it doesn't matter." No, Stephen, Karoline interrupted, her voice icy. You pick your targets carefully. You never go after those who pay your bills. You never mock your own. You go after the ones who threaten your little bubble. Karoline stood again, her posture unwavering, her voice growing stronger. The audience, frozen in place, understood they weren't watching a performance. They were witnessing a reckoning. There were no claps, no cheers, just a collective silence as the truth was laid bare. Charlie Kirk never needed your approval, Karoline continued, her voice gaining weight with every word. He didn't care about studio lights or applause. He lived and died speaking the truth, never needing a stage to do it. Her voice faltered for a brief moment, a slight crack betraying the deep emotion she held back. But she recovered quickly, almost whispering, "Your whole set is designed to mock truth. But today, truth stood here." Colbert tried to laugh, but it was hollow, forced. "That's a bit much, don't you think?" Karoline's stare held him. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Not as much as turning a dead man into a punchline. The room didn't erupt. The energy in the studio completely deflated. Colbert, usually a master at controlling the moment, now sat still, unable to recover. The only thing louder than Karoline's words was the palpable shame that filled the air. The cameras kept rolling, but the atmosphere had changed. The temperature, metaphorically, dropped. Something raw had broken loose, something Colbert and his team couldn't put back into the safe, comfortable box of comedy. Karoline stood at the centre of it all, unyielding. She didn't blink, didn't soften her stance. Her voice, though steady, had the strength of steel. "Do you even know what Charlie died doing?" Colbert, now clearly uncomfortable, shrugged. "I saw something online. A rally, I guess." "No," Karoline cut in. "He wasn't speaking at a rally. He wasn't trying to sway voters. He was holding the hand of a grieving father in East Palestine, a man whose daughter had died from chemical exposure, while your friends in Washington turned a blind eye." Colbert's attempt at a smirk faltered. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That's tragic, of course." Karoline's voice hardened. "No, don't pretend to care now. Not after you mocked him." The audience, once so eager for entertainment, now sat tense, aware that they weren't witnessing a show. This wasn't scripted. This was real. This was a confrontation, with no commercial breaks, no cue cards, no fallback. Karoline had left Colbert with nothing to rely on but his own discomfort. She moved closer, her presence undeniable. "You claim Charlie was just a talking head, disposable in your eyes. But he spent more time in forgotten American towns than you ever will. He worked to feed families, raise money for veterans, and fight for those who had been left behind. He was in the dirt, not behind a desk." The control room, in full panic, signalled for a shift. One producer whispered into Colbert's earpiece, urging him to move on, to change the subject, to lighten the mood. But Colbert knew, deep down, that there was no turning back now. Karoline's words pierced the silence with chilling precision. "People like you," she began, "think you hold the keys to truth because you wear fancy suits and get applause from a crowd trained to laugh on cue. But truth? Truth isn't some performance. It's sacrifice. It's standing firm in the heat when everyone else runs away." Her eyes scanned the room, pausing for a moment before meeting the camera. "Charlie stood in that heat, and if you're sitting at home, wondering if this country still values the ones who actually show up, ask yourself, would you rather be remembered for cheap laughs or for showing up when it mattered?" The studio fell into an even deeper silence. It wasn't just the words that hit home, it was the shift in the room's energy. The lights, once bright and commanding, seemed to lose their shine. Colbert's voice, now softer and far less assured, broke the silence. I didn't know him the way you did. Karoline's reply was immediate, almost biting. No, you didn't want to. She reached down and picked up the crumpled letter from the desk, unfolding it slowly. Her hand shook, not from fear, but from the force of holding back everything she wanted to say. She read aloud the line she knew would make an impact. If I die doing this, at least I'll die telling the truth. The audience let out a collective gasp. Karoline didn't break her gaze from Colbert. That line has aged better than your punchlines ever will. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. No one moved. They weren't sure what they were witnessing anymore. Was it a comedy show? A confrontation? Or was something much bigger at play? Karoline took the letter in her hands and folded it with the utmost care, as though it was something sacred. Colbert shifted in his seat, his usual charisma now evaporated, leaving him vulnerable. Look, Karoline, he began. I never meant to... To what? Karoline interjected sharply. To mock the memory of a man whose death you trivialized for views. For the first time in years, Colbert looked lost for words, his usual quick wit faltering under the weight of Karoline's words. She didn't relent. You're the kind of person who sneers from your ivory tower while the real America bleeds in silence, Karoline continued, her tone fierce and unwavering. You think it's edgy to belittle the people who actually build this country? A lone clap sounded from the audience, one hesitant applause that died out as the crowd realized there would be no collective support. Karoline's voice softened, but the danger in it grew. Charlie Kirk made you uncomfortable, she said. Not because he was loud or conservative, but because he was effective. He connected with people. He filled stadiums. He built something that didn't need your media machines, your gatekeepers or your donors, and you couldn't stand it. Colbert, attempting to recover, opened his mouth, but his words cracked and faltered. Karoline didn't let up. And now that he's gone, you feel safe to joke again. But let me tell you something, Stephen. She stood, not with drama or theatrics, but with the quiet confidence of someone who has nothing left to prove. You can sit behind that desk for the next 10 years, reading jokes written by people who've never stepped out of their bubbles. But the American people are waking up. And one day, Stephen, you'll look out at this studio and see something worse than outrage. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a chilling calm. You'll see empty seats. No clapping, no cues. Stepping back from the desk, she turned to face the camera. This isn't just about Charlie anymore. This is about what happens when we allow cheap one-liners to rewrite the legacies of those who stood for something real. The room was deathly quiet. No one clapped. No one cheered. Karoline didn't wait for applause. She didn't need it. And for once, neither did the audience. As she made her way off the stage, the silence didn't follow her. It stayed behind, hovering like a heavy fog over the set. The energy that had once filled the room, the laughter, the practiced cheers, was gone. Colbert sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as though it might anchor him to the ground. His eyes drifted to the producers through the glass. No one moved. There were no hand signals, no countdowns to wrap things up. Just an eerie stillness, faces uncertain of whether they were witnessing a broadcast collapse or something much more historic unfolding before them. Karoline's footsteps echoed in the stillness as she left the stage, leaving the studio suspended in the aftermath of her confrontation. Every step Karoline took echoed through the empty studio. The air was thick with tension. No one reached for their phones. No applause came from the audience. In the third row, an older woman quietly dabbed her eyes with a tissue. The silence felt louder than any applause could. Backstage, Karoline didn't break. She didn't crumble. She didn't shed a single tear. Instead, she handed the crumpled letter to her assistant, who stood ready. Scan it. We're publishing it tonight. Every word, she ordered in a steady, no nonsense tone. Her assistant nodded and rushed off to carry out the task. Karoline sat upright, unwavering, her heels still on, her eyes burning with intensity. Meanwhile, back on set, Colbert struggled to regain control, his usual charm slipping through his fingers. "Well, folks, lively discussion, huh?" he stammered. He forced a weak laugh. "She certainly doesn't hold back." But there was no response, not a single sound. The audience, gripped by the tension, remained silent. Then, out of nowhere, a voice rang out from the back of the room, unfiltered and clear. "She was right!" All eyes turned. It came from the sound tech, just a quiet guy who had spent years adjusting mic levels without ever making a scene. He didn't shout. He didn't try to steal attention. He just spoke the truth. "Charlie stood for something, and you mocked him when he died." Colbert's mouth twitched. His hands fumbled with the cue cards in his lap. Another voice broke through the silence, this time from a young man in the crowd. "What happened to you, Stephen?" Then, an older woman in the front row, wearing a small flag pin, added quietly, "Charlie had courage. You have a desk." The words hit like a tidal wave. The footage from the studio began to surface on social media platforms. Raw, unedited, direct from the cameras. No manipulation, no spin, just the truth. Within minutes, the hashtag #OshCharlieWasRight began to trend. But another hashtag quickly eclipsed it. "You have a desk." There was no twist, no fancy commentary, just millions of people watching as Colbert's mockery fell apart under the weight of one woman's unwavering truth. Back in the car, Karoline was already pulling out her phone, her hands moving with purpose. She typed 5 words, "Letter drops at midnight." K. Then, with a simple tap, the message was sent. As midnight struck, Karoline's post went live. No fancy edits, no dramatic soundtrack. Just a high-resolution scan of Charlie Kirk's original handwritten letter. No filters, no gimmicks. Just the raw words of a man who had spent his final moments fighting for the country he loved. The caption simply read, "This wasn't just a goodbye from a friend. It was a warning." The internet erupted. Within 10 minutes, the post had over 1 million impressions. The hashtag #ShutColbertIsOver trended worldwide. Celebrities, once silent, began sharing the letter in solidarity. No commentary, no extra words, just the letter itself. The truth spoke louder than anything else. The first paragraph hit with the force of a sledgehammer. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, but you're still here, and that means you have to fight harder. Not just for power or policy, but for the soul of the nation that raised us." The second paragraph cut deep. "The media doesn't care. They'll laugh at your loss, mock your prayers, and call your truth misinformation. But you keep speaking, because truth has no expiration date, and cowards have no legacy." By the time readers reached the third paragraph, the world stopped. "If my death becomes a joke to them, let it be the last joke they ever make without consequence." That line alone was reposted by senators, athletes, families of fallen soldiers, and veterans. It appeared on signs in cities from Dallas to Detroit. A mural began to form overnight in Phoenix. The words no longer belonged to Charlie alone. They had become the anthem of a movement. At 12:30 a.m., Karoline posted her follow-up video. Filmed in her car with no makeup, no lighting crew, and no teleprompter, she stared into the camera with quiet resolve. Her voice was calm but heavy with meaning. "You mocked a dead man on national television," she said. "You didn't mock me. You mocked millions of Americans who feel unseen, unheard, and disposable. So let me make one thing clear." She paused, her eyes unwavering. "You will be seen. This letter will be read in every high school that still believes in freedom, in every church that still preaches truth, and with those words, Karoline made sure the war was paying attention. One day, Karoline's actions would be archived in the Library of Congress. Colbert's jokes, however, would be relegated to the past. It was an inevitable contrast. As the views soared, even platforms that had previously attempted to suppress conservative voices couldn't stop the momentum. The tide was too strong, too authentic, too raw. Colbert's team, on the other hand, scrambled in desperation. Crisis management teams were called in. Segments were quickly cancelled. Apologies were drafted, only to be swiftly erased. No amount of damage control could repair what had already been done. The bell had been rung, and the entire nation was now wide awake. The next taping of The Late Show was abruptly cancelled. The audience was refunded, and Colbert's reputation, it was on fire. But Karoline, she wasn't gloating. She wasn't reveling in the chaos. She simply prepared for what was yet to come, the final, unavoidable confrontation. The network hesitated before agreeing to her request. They knew that Karoline wasn't asking for airtime to promote a book or sell a policy. What she sought was far more dangerous: real-time accountability. They agreed, but only on the condition that the encounter would be live. No pre-recorded segments, no edits, no reshoots, just her, the camera, and Colbert, sitting across from her for the first time since the infamous remark. When Karoline entered the set, the atmosphere was starkly different. Colbert didn't make a joke. His usual swagger was gone, replaced with a palpable tension. The producers whispered nervously behind the glass. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The red light flickered on. Colbert, trying to regain his footing, attempted to crack a joke. Well, looks like the cavalry's here. But Karoline didn't flinch. She leaned forward, slid a folder across the desk, and said firmly, "Read it aloud." Colbert glanced at the folder. Inside was the transcript of Charlie Kirk's final speech, the one he delivered just a week before his death, a speech Colbert had refused to air or even acknowledge. He chuckled nervously. "I don't think that's—" Karoline interrupted him, her voice razor-sharp. "You said he got what he deserved. Now, let the American people hear what he actually said before they decide what he deserved." The audience remained frozen in silence. No laughter, no applause, just a thick, tense quiet. Colbert hesitated for a long moment before he finally opened the folder and began reading. "Freedom is not a gift from government. It is a responsibility passed down through generations. If we fail to defend it, we don't lose a party. We lose a civilization." His voice faltered slightly, but he continued. "They will mock you for standing alone, but better to be mocked, standing for something, than praised, bowing to nothing." Colbert stopped, his eyes glued to the page in front of him, refusing to lift them. Karoline leaned in, her words barely above a whisper. "You turned a patriot's death into a punchline, and now all you've got is dead air." She rose slowly, standing tall and composed. She locked eyes with the camera, her voice resolute as she delivered her final statement. "Stephen Colbert wants you to believe this movement is dying, but the only thing dying here is his influence." Without waiting for applause or acknowledgement, Karoline turned and left the set. No grand gestures, no dramatic exit, just the stark truth, and millions of people already following in her wake. The clip went viral within minutes. It wasn't just shared on conservative networks, it spread everywhere. Even traditional media couldn't ignore it. Headlines lit up. Colbert, silenced by Charlie Kirk's final words, and Karoline Leavitt ends The Late Show's smirk era. It was clear. Truth had defeated comedy. As for Colbert, his ratings dropped 47% over the next 2 weeks. Sponsors began pulling back. Calls flooded in from former viewers who once laughed with him, now demanding to know why they had ever supported him in the first place. Karoline never returned to the studio. She didn't need to. She had already etched her message into the conscience of the country, not with bitterness, but with steadfast resolve. Sometimes the loudest voices are silenced, and sometimes the quietest truths shake the very foundations of everything. They mocked a man who stood for freedom. Karoline made the world listen. When Colbert thought he was delivering just another line, she turned his joke into silence. She transformed his stage into a courtroom. And this wasn't just a debate, it was justice. If you stand with truth, if you stand with Karoline, share this, spread it, make them hear it. Because next time they laugh, they'll remember what happened after.